Hi, my friends. Welcome to Deep Six, the Deep State. We've been getting over 100,000 views, over 150,000 even, views of each of our videos. So I'm really happy about that. It's great that this is really spreading throughout the country. Please share the broadcast so we can get this information out to a lot of people. Now, the mainstream media has not publicized this, despite Donald Trump's efforts. But the terrorist who killed 8 people in downtown Manhattan yesterday...
Sorry. My apologies.
Okay, sorry. That was me. Don't listen. But the terrorist who killed 8 people and wounded 30 others in a rampage in lower Manhattan yesterday was in the United States legally from the country of Uzbekistan, one of the former Soviet republics, Soviet countries in the Soviet Union. And he was here under the diversity visa lottery program, which is probably the craziest bill ever passed by the United States Congress, and that's doing something. It was sponsored and created by the mind of Chuck Schumer, the senator from New York, who is now the minority leader, wants to be the majority leader. And he had this brilliant idea. He said there's not enough diversity in the United States. We need more people from more countries coming into the U.S. So we'll admit everybody according to the quotas that we have. And then if there's any country that has fewer than 50,000 immigrants a year coming into the United States, we'll take everybody on their wait list and dump them into a gigantic lottery pool. And we'll pick 50,000 people from that pool randomly to let into the United States. Lately, they've mainly been coming from Africa. But in 1995, they came, 1999, I think, the terrorist, Sayfullo Saipov, came into the United States from Uzbekistan under this program. And as you know, was radicalized, became involved with ISIS, and now shows no regret at killing all of those people, and says he did it for ISIS. It was part of the war. Well, we don't need to let people into the United States to wage war on us. We have enough outside the United States. And the idea that the senator from New York opened the door for a program to let this guy into the country is really appalling. Schumer, by the way, shot back that Trump is dividing America and politicizing a national tragedy. Yeah, by saying who caused it and assigning the blame accurately to Senator Schumer. But this goes to, and he's now trying to eliminate this diversity waiver program. Absolutely crazy. Now, this highlights, though, the importance of a fundamental change in the way we decide how to admit people into the United States legally. While all the focus has been lately on illegal immigration and stopping it with the border wall and the E-Verify program, so employers have to know the immigration status of anybody they're hiring. The other question is the ones who we admit legally into the U.S. It's over 1 million a year. I think it's 1.1 million. And there's new legislation called the RAISE Act, which has been RAISE, R-A-I-S-E. It stands for something, but it's basically designed to raise incomes in the United States by limiting the flow of immigrants from abroad. And that's very important. There's a study that was put out by the Center for Immigration Studies that went back to the year 2000, and it asked the question, how many people hold jobs in the United States who were born in the United States, and how many people hold jobs in the United States who were not born in the United States. The second category includes naturalized citizens, legal green card holders, and illegal immigrants. And they found that there had been virtually no increase in the number of people holding jobs who were born in the United States. And all of the job growth was to accommodate people who have not been born in the United States. They literally took something like 94% of the jobs over this period of time. So the RAISE Act is designed to eliminate and reduce that competition, so the companies hire Americans, pay them better wages, and eliminate this wage stagnation that has gripped our economy, and undermined our efforts at prosperity, because the lower middle income people believe that this all goes to the top and none of it filters down to them. And the reason for that is because we let all of these workers into the United States who will work for almost nothing. And that creates a level of competition for those jobs that is incredibly intense. By the way, I've said this before, but I think it's worth explaining again. That's why Abraham Lincoln opposed slavery. It wasn't just a moral consideration for him. It was that he had gone from being a subsistence farmer in Kentucky and then Illinois, who got no cash income, to getting a job on the Mississippi River in a riverboat. And when he got his cash income, it was like an incredible discovery of his, that he could use this income to move up in the world, to become an attorney, and to really make something of himself. But he said, how can you have a wage system when there are 5 million people who can be forced to work for nothing, slaves? And he looked at Thomas Jefferson, and he said, yeah, you want equality for everybody. You want people to be yeoman farmers, which means subsistence farmers, which means no cash, and you're stuck in that niche for the entire rest of your life. What do you worry? You have all these slaves and plantation. You don't have to worry about that. And then when Jefferson decided to diversify and go from farming to other industries to help make Monticello pay, he set up a nail factory, to hammer for nails that you hammer into the wall. And he had his slaves work in it. And Lincoln said, for God's sakes, how can we get somebody a decent paying job making nails when slaves do it at Monticello and you don't have to pay them anything? So that whole concept of limiting migration to raise wage levels, I think is fundamental to the immigration debate. And a bunch of conservative senators, led, I believe, by Tom Cotton of Arkansas, a fabulous senator, a guy I've worked with in the past, and I think Cassidy of Louisiana, but I could be wrong, have introduced the RAISE Act. First of all, it cuts the number of legal immigrants in half to 500,000 a year. But then it eliminates this business of we'll let you into the United States based on where your family is or what country you come from. Originally, when immigration was first limited in the 1920s, before that there was no limits. We wanted every immigrant we could possibly get to build the Transcontinental Railroad and industrialize America. And we just loved them as they came off the boat. But by the 1920s, they were competing for jobs with Americans, and they passed the first immigration legislation. And it had immigration by country. And it was a thoroughly racist law. It said you basically have to be Northern European, Scotch, or Irish to get into the United States. You had to be, in effect, white. But in 1960, under President Kennedy, we changed the law to increase the quotas from third world countries and make it fairer. But it was still based on where you came from. Then when illegal immigration began to swell, and millions and tens of millions of people came into this country illegally, the issue then became to reunify families. If the mother and father were already here, to bring the children over, or vice versa, or the uncles or the aunts or the brothers and sisters. And family reunification became the fundamental goal of the immigration policy. Now Congress says the hell with that. We don't want to know why they need to come to America. We want to know if we need them to come to America. Not will it do them good, but will it do us good? And it says that the basis of immigration should be merit selection. Do you have skills? Do you have training that we need in the United States? Are you a doctor? Are you a nurse? Are you an engineer? Have you been to college? Are you educated? All of those questions, rather than just simply who's your relative and do you have anybody in the United States that can vouch for you, and that we could reunite a family. And that's called the RAISE Act, and Trump is endorsing it and may insist on that as a condition of legalizing the Dreamers, who were subject to Obama's amnesty, and Trump overruled that amnesty and said that he would give Congress 6 months to pass a bill allowing it, but he wants amendments made to mirror his immigration policy. And if there was ever an example of how crucial it is to do that, it is this guy who came here under the the diversity waiver lottery. Now, it's worth noting that the reason this rampage did not result in dozens of deaths is that the terrorist was shot by a police officer who obviously had a gun, who was not called in connection with this episode. He was called because Stuyvesant High School, which is my alma mater, I graduated from there, is located right there, right near where the terrorist was, on the site of the old World Trade Center. And there was a girl who was having a mental problem who went to Stuyvesant. There was a suicide threat, and the cop was dispatched to deal with that. And while he was doing that, he noticed that this guy ran over a lot of people and was coming out of his car with guns to begin killing even more. And he took his police revolver and shot the guy, actually not dead, but in the leg. He still is alive, and arrested him and prevented further damage, once again showing that the real instrument and weapon against terror is a gun in the hands of somebody who is not a terrorist. More guns mean less crime. Fundamental slogan of the NRA, and a point liberals just do not seem to get, even though as the number of guns in America has increased dramatically in the last few years, the number of murders with guns has decreased dramatically over the same period of time and in the same geographic areas. Yes?
We have a question from Cheryl Kilborn. She wants to know, why are we revetting those refugees who filtered into our country during the Obama reign?
Well, we can't revet them because they won't present themselves. They're here legally, and we probably can figure out who they are, but we probably can't figure out where to find them. The important thing now is to vet new people who come in, with one exception. A big part of the immigration debate that is totally ignored, and in books that Eileen and I have written, we keep raising this, is that about a third or a half of illegal immigrants in the United States come here legally on visas, student visas, travel visas, work visas, and when they expire, they don't renew them, and they don't leave the country, and they're now here illegally. And a great many of the terrorists are here by that means. And we don't know who they are. We know who came into the country, but we have no record at all of who left the country. When you come into the United States, you have to go through a passport thing, you have to be fingerprinted, you have your photo taken, I think there's an iris scan in some cases, but when you leave the United States, just go to your boarding gate and get on a plane and go. We have no idea who leaves. So we have no idea who are the visa overstays that are remaining here. The solution is to set up an exit process where we can tell who leaves and cross them off the list of people who got visas in the first place to see those who remain. And then you particularly focus on them from terror-sponsoring countries, Trump's list of countries where you might deny them visas, and you go around, you ask them, you round them up, and you deport them. They're here illegally, and that would be a very effective step to take.
And we have a question from Frank Beerfan. He says, Diane...
Hey, Frank, thank you. You've asked a number of questions,
yes,
and I love it.
Very loyal.
I love the name Beer Fan. Do you have a friend named Wine Fan?
That would be me. Frank says, Dianne Feinstein told the execs of Facebook, Twitter, and Google, if they can't regulate quote-unquote fake news, Washington will. Do you believe in regulations for these companies? And if so, how would you do it?
Not fake news. Porn, maybe. Certainly child abuse and pedophilia, but not fake news. We can't get into that. Let's pull that up. I wasn't planning to do this until a little later in the show, but as always, your questions raise stuff and make me interested in that, make me raise it earlier. The Facebook and the internet companies have released some of the social media ads that Russia placed in the United States to influence the American election. And they're available online through Politico.com. And I looked at them, and it is ridiculous to say that these ads would in any way influence the election. It's absolutely ludicrous. There's one ad here. I'm afraid I can't show it to you here, but it's incredible. There's Jesus Christ arm wrestling with the devil. And it's below, it says, "Press like to help Jesus win." And the headline is, "Satan, if I win, Clinton wins. Jesus, not if I can help it." Well, that's really persuasive, right? I mean, that just makes you run right out and vote for Trump. The other ad is a group of Texans with longhorns and hats and riding herd, and it says, "Get ready to secede," and it promotes Texas secession from the Union, and it talks about how important that is. And there's another one that's anti-gay rights and talks about that issue. But they're puerile. They're insane. They're ludicrous. This couldn't influence a baboon to vote in the election. I mean, even somebody who had a fifth grade reading level would not be influenced by that. I mean, they're one step above a comic book. And for that to be why Hillary lost the election is just completely crazy and laughable. Now, less laughable is my next news item, and it comes courtesy of Cal Thomas, who's a very dear friend of mine and writes columns throughout the United States. At one point, he was, and may still be, the most widely syndicated columnist in the United States. And he wrote a piece about how Congress exempts itself from the sexual harassment law. In other words, if members of Congress sexually harass people, they do not have to meet the fate of Harvey Weinstein because they took care of themselves in the law. First of all, this applies to members of Congress and their staffs. And it was a law passed in 1995. And it says that if you want to complain that you were sexually harassed by a congressman or a senator or a member of his staff, you have to go through counseling and mediation, which often lasts a month. Now, why do I have to go through counseling if he sexually harassed me? I mean, if he can't keep his hands and his looks to himself, why do I need to go through counseling? And it also means there's a tremendous disincentive from anybody levying a complaint, which is its intent. And mediation, what do you call in the guy and the victim and the perpetrator and say, "Can't you guys get together?" Well, I didn't mean to put my hand down your blouse, but how about a quick peck on the cheek? How does mediation apply to that? And get this, if you sue and you recover, if you're a victim and you sue a member of Congress or a member of the staff, he doesn't pay. We do. The United States Treasury pays. We pay, you and me. So if a congressman harasses somebody, you don't get these kind of verdicts that Bill O'Reilly was getting or Weinstein was getting, where they run $10, $15, $20 million out of their pocket. It comes out of our pocket. And so far, $15.2 million has been paid out by the U.S. government to people who are victims of sexual harassment by congressmen, senators, or their staffs. Do you believe that? That is absolutely the worst law I can imagine. It's incredible.
Well, Dick, this is off topic, but Brandon Altos, also a very loyal follower, wants to know I would ask you about Ed Klein's new book, All Out War, The Plot to Destroy Trump.
I bought it. I haven't read it yet. I love Ed Klein. He's very accurate. He gets his stuff, my God knows what ways. I hope nothing illegal, but boy, he gets the real dirt, and I look forward to reading it.
And Richard Reel wrote in actually yesterday, and I told him I would ask you this. He says, because Manafort's charges will likely go to trial, doesn't this mean that Mueller's appointment as special prosecutor will extend at least 2 to 3 years to try that case?
Yes, if it does go to trial, it would. I doubt that that's going to go to trial. I think that it's a device to squeeze Manafort and come to a plea deal. And at some point, they're going to have to do that. But you raise an interesting point. The grand jury that indicted Manafort originally sat in Northern Virginia, where Manafort lives. Mueller moved the jurisdiction to Washington, D.C., and in doing so, he completely changed the jury pool. The jury pool for Northern Virginia would have a good share of Trump voters, would be more white than black, more upper income than lower income, and more representative of the country. The jury pool for Washington, D.C. is hopeless. 85% of the district voted for Hillary, not for Trump. And it's almost 60% African American. And the jury pool you're going to get there will hate the Trump administration, hate Trump, and hate Manafort. And his odds of his getting a fair trial there are almost none. Now, if he had no choice, it would be one thing. But Mueller is pretty damn sneaky in moving the thing to D.C. from Northern Virginia for no apparent reason. It's not a question of convenience. Most of his people probably live in Northern Virginia anyway. And he did it solely so that he could get largely black juries, largely Democratic juries, and he wouldn't have difficulty getting indictments or convictions. Now, I'd like to talk about the issue of state and local tax deductions on your federal income tax. As you know, right now you are permitted to deduct any money you pay either on property taxes, personal property taxes, income taxes, sales taxes, and the like. Sales taxes, you have to itemize them. But it's a very, very big source of tax deductions and will cost the United States $1.3 trillion over the course of the next 10 years. Now, it's a benefit that is very much allocated toward the wealthy. First of all, 70% of Americans do not itemize their deductions at all. And if this new tax cut passes, probably go up to 85%. And only about half of those, about 15% of the total, deduct state and local taxes, who tend to be upper income people. But most of the deductions come from a handful of Democratic states. New York and California get a third of the deductions, even though they're only about 15% of America's population. And a handful of states get half of it, so that it's very geographically concentrated, largely in blue states, Democratic states, where the governors and the legislatures pass out tax increases like they were, biscuits. And they do it in part because they know that their taxpayers will be shielded from the impact of that by their ability to deduct those payments on their federal income tax. And Trump is now looking at curtailing that deduction and plowing it back into the taxpayers by lowering the tax rate we have to pay. And it's running into an opposition from Republican congressmen. There are no senators, but congressmen who come from states where there are high income taxes. And there are all kinds of varieties under consideration. One is to exempt income taxes. One is to permit deductibility of property taxes, but not income taxes, which would focus it even more on the rich in a few states that have high income taxes. Or others that say you could choose, do you want a property tax deduction or a mortgage interest deduction? Most plans keep mortgage interest deductions, but some might put that choice on the table. We won't know for a few days until the House reports its legislation. Now, if Trump is successful in passing this tax cut, and if he succeeds in eliminating or curtailing the deduction for state and local taxes under any of those formulations, it will bring about the most fundamental change in our country. It'll completely reshape the United States as we know it. We always assumed that was Obama's goal in bringing 10 million illegal immigrants into the United States to try to make the electorate more friendly to the Democratic Party. But that's nothing compared to the impact of this elimination of this deduction. It means that if you live like in New York State, where there's about an 8% tax, and New York City is about 2%, So combined, you have a 10% income tax, and you make $300,000 a year. That means you can't deduct the $30,000 you're paying in income taxes, and it means that that you're going to have to pay $10,000 more. If you could deduct the 30, it meant that you wouldn't pay taxes on 40% of the 30, which comes to $12,000. Now you'll be hit with that, and you'll have to pay it. And already the high tax rates in the Northeast are stimulating massive out-migration from those states. Connecticut has lost, I think, 30,000 people in the last year, almost all high-income people fleeing the high taxes. Now, if you eliminate the deductibility for those taxes, this will become an avalanche. It'll become a flood of people leaving New York and California and Illinois and Connecticut and the high-tax states and moving to Florida and Texas and the various southern states that are low-tax states. Probably not including Pennsylvania because it has only a 3%, but most of those other big blue states have very high income taxes. And this will fundamentally change America. It'll impoverish the Northeast. It'll empower the Republican Sunbelt states. And when you do this on top of what Obama just did, which is that he expanded Medicaid from the poverty level to 35% above the poverty level, dramatically enabling 10 million new people to become eligible for Medicaid, and he's paying for it with a 90% federal contribution. But in a year or two, that's going to drop to 60%, and the northern states are going to have to absorb a huge amount of money for new Medicaid recipients. The southern states largely won't, because they largely refused to implement the new Medicaid rules. The Supreme Court gave them that option. So Florida and Texas didn't, and they'll continue to keep their taxes down. While not only will the northern states not be able to deduct their their state tax payments, but those state tax payments are going to increase dramatically as the Medicaid costs increase. This is an entitlement program. Anybody can walk in and get it and rack up huge bills. And the financial consequences of that for these states are going to be horrific. And of course, the more people leave, the higher the taxes have to go. And we all go into spirals, just like Detroit, where the tax base shrinks, the tax increases rise, the expenditures rise, more people are being covered by government grants, and then that makes more people move out, the tax base shrinks, and this vicious cycle continues to run. That's what ended up making Detroit increasingly a graveyard rather than a city. And that process may well happen to major cities in New York and California and New Jersey and Massachusetts and Illinois, and they'll only have Connecticut, and they'll only have themselves to blame because of their high levels of taxes.
Dick, Brittany Pearson wants to know, aside from deportation, what punishments exist for those who overstay their visas?
None, unless they commit crimes here. There is no punishment. You just get deported, and it becomes very difficult for you to come back because your name is on a watch list. And I think that's fine. I don't think we need to put people in jail for that, but we do need to get them out of the country.
And Thomas Hillebrand asks, how can Trump bust up the Ninth Circuit Court?
Well, the Ninth Circuit is, of course, the circuit court for California. And because the senators from California have always been Democrats, and from Oregon, and from Washington, and one of the two from Nevada, and maybe even one or two from Arizona over the years, although they're both now Republican, most of the appointments in that venue are to liberal Democrats, even under Republican presidents, because the old rule was that the senators have to agree to the appointment. Now that rule is not a law, it's a custom. It's less than a custom, it's really a courtesy that the president extends to members of the Senate. And I don't think Trump should keep doing that. I think Trump should say, go to hell. I'm going to nominate anyone to this court that I want to. And because the Senate has given up the right to filibuster his judicial appointments, that was a Democratic measure, they can't stop him if the Republicans block vote in favor of that. And I hope that the Republicans get together and say, are we going to confirm all of Trump's judicial appointments, and we can do it by block vote, and we're going to let him make the appointment, and we don't give a damn whether the Democratic senators approve or not. Now, we would still keep in place the blue slip, which is what that endorsement is called, system for Republican senators. But why do it for Democratic senators?
Dick Candy Brinson asks, couldn't Sessions make Mueller move the trial back to Virginia, saying that's where Manafort lives and where his possible wrongdoings occurred?
Well, it's not Sessions' decision. It's up to the judge who's overseeing the case, who is a district court judge appointed by Obama, a woman. And fat chance that she's ever going to do that.
And here's a new name. Joe Card wants to know, can judges who go against the president with immigration laws be fired?
No, federal judges have lifetime tenure, but they, and there's no way around that. But on the other hand, there are lots of vacancies that come up, and you can fill it with people who will be like-minded. But the main thing is you can reverse them on appeal. If the circuit court doesn't reverse it, the Supreme Court will. We now have 5 conservatives on the Supreme Court, and when Ruth Bader Ginsburg dies or steps aside, we're going to have 6. And we can ultimately win that battle on appeal. Now, this video, as the others, is sponsored by the Patriot Gold Group. And if you want to know why gold is the best investment you can make, just look at North Korea. Whenever there's a threat of war, whenever there's the threat of global instability, currencies always crash, stocks crash, but what keeps its value is gold and silver. And that's an excellent reason to get in touch with the Patriot Gold Group, patriotgoldgroup.com, or phone the number Renee is going to put on the screen.
I just posted it. Would you like me to
Good.
announce the number?
Yes.
1-800-476-5675. It's ingrained in my brain.
Good. Wish it were in mine. Now, something really interesting here, guys. The teachers' union, which I hate above all other things, has lost 9% of its membership since the year 2000. It's gone from 79% of teachers down to 70% of teachers, of public school teachers. Now, the reason I hate the teachers' union is that it has transformed our schools into public works projects run by the teachers, for the teachers, and only incidentally for the students. Albert Shanker, who founded the teachers' union, said it best. He said, when children and students start paying union dues, then I'll act in their interest. And that philosophy has characterized the teachers' union throughout. They've convinced us that the more money we spend on education, the better schools we're going to get. Well, by far the largest per student expenditure is Washington, D.C., and by far the lowest graduation rate, the highest dropout rate, and the worst test scores come from Washington, D.C. The fact of the matter is that the rules that dominate the teachers' union, that the teachers' union enforces, have really forced low-quality education on America's schools. In New York City, for example, there are 5,000 teachers who go every day to what's called the rubber room, 5 of the 80,000 teachers in New York City. And they're put there because they are too abusive, too senile, too incompetent, or too just plain nuts to be exposed to the children in classrooms. But they can't be fired because of the union rules. So they show up every day. They're sent to what is called the rubber room, where they sit around every day reading a book or reading the newspaper or staring at the television set. And they get full pay and benefits and fringes and insurance and can't be fired. In fact, when New York State had to cut its education budget because of the recession, Mayor Bloomberg at the time pleaded with the teachers' union to please let me fire some of the teachers in the rubber room because they're not any good. And the teachers' union said, no way. Last hired, first fired. So instead he had to fire an entire class of promising, brilliant, creative, enthusiastic young teachers who were recruited under the Teach America program, where a proportion of the graduating classes of the top schools in America, the Ivy League schools, became teachers in return for guaranteed immediate jobs. And they were fired because of the protecting these vested interests of teacher tenure. The teacher contracts go way beyond benefits and pay. They limit class size and teaching methods and all of that stuff. Now in Wisconsin, Scott Walker defied the teachers' union and prohibited their bargaining over anything other than pay and benefits and hours. And as a result, he really has improved school quality in Wisconsin. And he provided for annual elections by the unions to certify that the teachers still wanted the union. And they lost a majority, I think 2/3 majority of the elections. So the number of teachers unionized in Wisconsin has dropped like crazy, and the number of teachers throughout America in the unions has now dropped. In a few years it'll approach critical mass, and then maybe we can make our schools good again.
Dick, we have a question from Eric Lawson. We have a lot of new names today. Is Roger Stone helping or hurting President Trump? What is your experience with him?
Oh, my God.
He loves our show.
Roger. Huh. Do you know that Stone on his back has a life-size tattoo of Richard Nixon's face?
Oh, my goodness.
He worked for Nixon and after he left the White House, and Stone has a tattoo on his back. Not a small one. I've seen it. Waist to neck, the whole back is a tattoo of Richard Nixon's face. Incredible. Roger is Roger. He's sui generis. He's kind of his own person. And sometimes he's enormously insightful and brilliant, and sometimes he's just cuckoo. And you never know. For example, he has been very effective in any number of Senate and governor races by forming third parties and independent entities and using them to help win the election. And he just recently wrote a very important book called Did LBJ Kill JFK, or something like that, that raises a lot of very good points with a lot of fascinating evidence to indicate that Johnson may have conspired to kill Kennedy. I said in one of the earlier videos that it's pretty clear that Kennedy was going to drop Johnson from the ticket in 1964, because Johnson had been the target of investigations on two huge scandals during his Senate career. And in fact, Time magazine, in its November 22nd issue, was going to feature Johnson on the cover with a big story about all the investigations and about how he might be dropped from the ticket. Once Kennedy was killed and Johnson became president, they scrubbed the cover and they put on something very different, praising Johnson because he was now the president. But he had a lot of motivation to kill Kennedy, and a lot of the deep state conspirators from the CIA and the FBI and the mob that may have been involved in that assassination had a deep reason for getting rid of Kennedy. The mob, because he and Bobby were the first president and attorney general to really go after organized crime aggressively. And by the way, the last, although Reagan did a lot and almost put the mob out of business, but everybody else was terrified because of the assassinations of Jack and Bobby. Also, the defense industry and the military-industrial complex was worried that Kennedy would make peace with Russia and wind down the Cold War and put them out of business. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy had second thoughts. He had been a hawk before then. But he said, oh my God, we almost blew up the world. Let's renegotiate and rethink this. And in fact, he concluded a test ban treaty with the Russians, which may have been the opening to peace. So Stone has a great book about that. Stone was a good friend of Trump's, an employee of his. He lobbied for Trump. Trump wanted to stop casinos from being built in the Adirondack area of New York, in the Catskills, the mountains in New York, so that people would still go to his casinos in Atlantic City, and he hired Roger to try to kill those casinos. So who knows if he helps Trump or not? Who knows?
We have a question from...
I lost count.
Pamela Lechuga. Why can't liberals understand these fundamental facts of doling out instead of job and job benefits?
For a very important reason. Well, what's the name of the person?
Her name is Pamela Lechuga.
Hey, Pamela, thank you for asking that. It's a fundamental question and a very, very good one. Democrats and liberals say that they are in it to help the poor and to help people who are not skilled and don't necessarily have the means to make a good living, either because of their own lack of skills or because of their race or ethnicity or immigration status or disability or what have you. But the fact of the matter is that most of their support for the Democratic Party comes from those workers, but more importantly, from their unions and from the various interests that protect them. And those unions, like the teachers' union, ultimately have much more clout than the recipients of the service do. So the Democratic Party really doesn't care much about what children want. It does care about what parents. It does care about what teachers want. And as a result, the Democratic Party exists largely because the population of people dependent on government benefits exists. So when you get somebody who goes out and gets a job and earns money and pays taxes on the job, he's probably going to be a Republican, more likely than a Democrat, because the Republicans really only get their support from people who are making a living and self-sustaining. But if he goes on welfare and gets a handout, he's going to vote for the party that will give it the most money in a handout, and that's almost always the Democratic Party. So it isn't so much a question of the Democrats not getting it. It's a question of the fact that the more poor people there are, the more people who are dependent on government, the better the Democrats do, and the worse that they do. I saw this blatantly when I worked in Central Europe, including the Ukraine, against Putin and against Manafort. And what I found was all of these Eastern European countries, Poland, Hungary, Romania, were divided into two sections, those who worked in the private sector and those who didn't. Roughly 50% worked for private business, and they all voted against the old communist parties. 50%, though, were students, unemployed, government workers, or retirees, and they all voted for the post-communist parties because they were dependent on pensions. And when the communists took power in those countries, the first thing they did was lower the retirement age to 50, so that more people would quit work and more people would be dependent on handouts, and they would have a shot at winning those elections. Now, speaking of jobs, they released the job creation stats today, and since Donald Trump has been president, 2.1 million jobs have been created in the United States. An unbelievable statistic. Absolutely incredible. Hats off to you, Donald Trump. By the time he leaves, by the time his first year is over, it'll probably be up around 3 million, which will be almost double Obama's best year. Now, the selfie of the day, that's again the person who's holding up Rogue Spooks, my new book, is Shelley Ray Murphy, and we're going to put Shelley's picture on the website. And by the way, for Christmas or any occasion, if you want to give a signed copy of Rogue Spooks to anybody, buy it on Amazon. But to get the signed part, go to promos.
No.
I'm sorry, Dick Morris Promos. Yes. Dick Morris Promos, one word, PROMOS, at gmail.com. And say that you want a book plate, put in your address, and put in what you want me to write. You know, happy birthday, Tom, or happy 80th birthday, Mom, or whatever you want, and I'll be happy to write that. And
or Merry Christmas, Renee.
Or Merry
Just
Christmas,
kidding.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much for watching. This was terrific. Really enjoyed it.